Let's just Billy Graham by that time. And we arrived at this little church, and we had what's called a parsonage. Do you know what a parsonage is? A parsonage is like the little somewhat of a house. It's like the Zinn house. Ours was the crag of Bing Avenue. and then we had mice. Then we had mice. We had everything. I didn't know what a silverfish was until I'd hear my mom. She'd put me to bed, and she'd go to have a bath. I was just a little kid in bed, and I'd hear, "Doug, there's a silverfish in the bathtub." And Dad would come, and we were constantly killing things in there. And it was, I shouldn't talk too much about this because we're recording it, and some of those people might still be alive who gave us that place. But this was Kadesh. This was Bing. This was Zinn. And my parents said when they walked in, they stood there together and held hands and looked around and literally got down on their knees and cried, not thanking God. They actually cried like, "This is where you've brought us." And my mom's thinking, as bad as Hay River, Northwest Territories was. Now that's cold. That's a rough place. That was their Egypt. As bad as Hay River was. No offense if you're from Hay River, by the way. I was born there, so I was born in Egypt. And so, as bad as that was, this definitely wasn't where they thought they were going. And it definitely wasn't where we went and ended up. And we saw God's faithfulness over the years, and God brought us through that time. That was a wilderness time. But there was some grumbling, and there was some complaining, and there was some stuff that had to die in the transition. There was some work that God did in my father's heart and my mother's heart and all of our hearts. God began to work on us, and these places of wilderness can be so difficult. You can even call them traumatic. There was a time when I thought Christians should never suffer trauma. And then I started to hear stories of some of the greats that God used. They were some funny people. And they weren't even born funny. They ended up funny because of persecution, because of trial, because of the things that the Lord allowed them to go through. And if you don't think that's biblical, ask Jacob, who had to walk with a limp for the rest of his life because of God, because of his journey, because of the stuff that had to die in him along the way. Another man, you'd know him, a general of the faith, still alive. You'd know him if I mentioned his name. And I remember saying to my dad, "Dad, why does he look so sickly?" We had him at our church. And Dad told me about what he had told him, that he had gone through this, and this, and it was very real wilderness of life. But it was for God to be able to trust him and use him. He went through humility. Is all of that kind of stuff from God? No, sometimes it is the devil. Sometimes you do need to say, "This is evil," and we rebuke that thing. Other times, God is leading you through a wilderness experience that is dealing with you and pressing on you and changing you. And many people have had to go through things, especially in this past few years, that were actually traumatic. Traumatic. And you see that Israel is going through these situations that are not pretty. How many know what I'm talking about? The trauma, the things we go through that we pick up along the way. I can tell you firsthand that ministry can be a traumatic experience. But you know that you can't go back to being a rapper. Like you'll never go back there. You're not where you're going to be and where God has promised you to be, but you're somewhere along the journey. You're in transition. 11:11, 1:1:1, you're transitioning into the promises of God. And I want to declare over you tonight, I want to put a marker here, in the land of PEI, and say that you, church, especially this church, is in transition. You are in transition. You're not where you once were, and you cannot go back, but you're not where you're going to be yet, so don't stop now. Clap your hands for Jesus. Don't stop now. So they wanted to go back. They wanted to turn around. And the grumbling began. And the disbelief began. Critical spirit began. They began to challenge their leader. And that's really what happens. How many have ever been on a missions trip before? You've been to a rough place, maybe. My first real missions trip, because the one I went to with my youth group was in Jamaica. We did a lot of beach ministry. It wasn't as bad, but this one, we drove from BC all the way down to the lower part of Mexico, if you can believe that. That's a long drive. So we didn't fly, we drove, and there were like 14 of us or 13 of us in one van. In one van. This is a true story. It was one of those extended vans, but there was barely any room for anything. The only time you could really lay down was the very back where you store stuff. And as the journey got long, we began to grumble. And we were fighting over that back area there because people wanted to stretch out and people wanted to lay down. And we were going there to do the work of the Lord, but we were becoming more and more backslidden as we drove. You know, somebody would want the windows open. Somebody would want them closed. If you sat at the back, some of the diesel or whatever would come back and be sucked back into the window. You'd be breathing that in. And it's embarrassing to say this, but do you know we didn't stay in hotels on the way down? This is a true story. My parents even offered to bring deliverance and send a plane ticket to bring me home. And I said, Mom and Dad, I'll be so embarrassed because they already tease me that I'm from Toronto. And, and I'm out here in BC. And so the men would sleep out in the grass with a sleeping bag. And you'd unpack the sleeping bag and the women would sleep in the van. Like we went all the way down to the lower part of Mexico. And we were ministering along the way. And the pastor was so happy that he had set up these meetings. And Pastor Ed, if you ever watch this, I'm so thankful for you. This did do a deep work of character building for me. Like, you know, I cleaned toilets. Everything happened on this trip. It was more than Zin and Kadesh. It was a crag for sure. And so as we went down there, we ended up doing some ministry up in the mountains. And I thought, you know, there'd be a place to sleep. And we were sleeping literally in the wilderness. The toilet that everybody had to use was 2 sticks with a sheet that protected this raised hole, and the sheet was mostly blowing in the wind. I just wouldn't use it, you know. So in the middle of the night, I found myself out in a field, terrified because a cow walked by, and I was just, you know, for me, I would rather go back to Egypt for sure. and you know, so we went to have lunch the next day, and the precious lady who was pastoring there, you know, she's sweeping away scorpions from where we were, and she made chicken soup, but we struggled with the chicken soup because we noticed she didn't have a fridge. And so somebody got salmonella poisoning, and so he was grumbling. He was more than grumbling. Let me tell you, ever see someone with salmonella poisoning? And so he was along the way. We were just, I mean, we were facing everything on this challenge. And by the time we got down there to where we were to stay, we were now told we were going to build a church. And I am, despite my physique, I'm not much of a builder. And I'm not so strong that way. And we had to move bricks from one place to another and cement. And I thought, why don't these people do this? Why are we doing this for these people? And, you know, I'm grumbling, complaining, and phoning home. And I'm so close to taking the plane ticket out of this wilderness. And I think, God couldn't be in this. And I began to grumble about the pastor. And I had a couple other people, and we're grumbling about the pastor behind his back. And can you believe it? My first day of moving all those bricks, I get terribly sick, violently sick. And I'm out for 10 days and in bed. And, you can only get up and walk about 10 feet, and you've got to lay down again. And to my shock and horror, the pastor said, well, we still need you to play that part of so-and-so in the drama, because we don't have anybody to fill in for you. And he talked to me about character, and I just hated everything about ministry at this point. I just hated everything about ministry at this point. And I didn't know where God was taking me. And I had left the music industry for this. Like, really? I had left, we don't clean anything. It's just the opposite. I had left the music business, and God, this is what you've called me to? This is what you've called me to. I would rather go back, as bad as that was. Anything is better than this. And I'm down there, and it didn't get any better. I prayed for a miracle. I didn't get healed. I had to get up and do the drama, and about every 10 minutes doing the drama, I would run off to the side of the stage there where I would into a bucket and come back and continue on. This is a true story. And so we would pile into that van and go to the next place. And on our way back up from Mexico, we were still on this journey. This was a real wilderness experience. I remember the real icing on the cake. See, by this time, and I had thought I was the preacher, because God had already begun to use me speaking a few places. So I thought I was a big deal. Why? Because I didn't have character formed yet. I hadn't had enough wilderness in me. I still had some Egypt in me. And God needed me to go through the wilderness. I needed an immunity shot. To keep you from the flu, they inject you with a little bit of the flu so that you build up an immunity to the flu. I needed some of that stuff done, some real character work to be put through some things so that I wouldn't bring any of the old into the new, into the promised land. And that's what was happening to me. And I remember they announced at this arena they had outside that they were going to have two of us. We're going to give the evangelistic message. This was a crusade. And I thought, well, surely they're going to pick me. I'll be one of the speakers at this crusade. And to my shock, they didn't pick me to preach at the crusade. And I'm a good preacher, and I've experienced preaching, and God was trying to kill that in me. Because if he didn't get that out of me there, I would bring it up here with you tonight. And God just couldn't use me because there was too much of me in it. And so I was told that these would be the two people that were speaking, and the pastor said, actually, Derek, we're going to ask you to stay behind to do some ministry at the homeless shelter. I was so angry. I was so angry. And now I know they did it on purpose because they could see the Egypt in me that I couldn't see in me. And so they asked me to stay behind, and I said, well, what do I have to do? The floors are clean, the people are fed, and we need you to clean the washrooms and the toilets. I wanted to go back to Egypt. I was ready to quit. And there's a point that you come to in every wilderness transition where it's like the point of no return, where you're going to either go all the way with God despite what's going on, or you're going to turn around and go back to Egypt. And the tough part is you're in this middle place where you're not where you're promised to be yet. You're not where you were, but you just can't quit now. This is the time to not give in. And so I mustered up my whatever Christianity I had in me at that point. And I said, okay, God, if you're testing me, if this is my wilderness, I'm going to pass this dang test. And I put on those big yellow awful gloves, And I went into those bathrooms, and while the crusade was going on, I was on my knees cleaning toilets. It's a true story. I have toilet ministry. Anointed for toilets. And I found my voice in there. I thought, well, if I have to do this dirty work, I'm going to worship while I do it. And I began to worship the Lord and clean these toilets. And I would like to tell you that it was a glorious, anointed experience, and the presence of God flooded that room. But the only thing flooding, I didn't feel anything. I was still ticked off, but cleaned the toilets that night. And so we all piled into that van, and we were heading back up, and finally we crossed the border, at least into the U.S., and I was so excited, and we had to pull over to sleep at a truck stop, and the guys were going to sleep on the lawn again. And I remember thinking, okay, we're coming into the promised land here, and the guys were telling me that you sleep in your sleeping bag naked. I'm sorry to say this, but because it's more warmth. Some of you are nodding your heads. I guess you know that this is true. Well, I chose not to do that, but they did, and got into our sleeping bags there. And I'm so tired. I'm so worn out of this wilderness trip. And just as I'm falling asleep on the lawn there, we hear this sound that I'll never forget. And a sprinkler system came on. Massive sprinkler system. These are all true wilderness stories I'm telling you here. The sprinkler system came on, and all you saw were the guys on the team naked running across. Now, I just had my boxers on, thank God, and we were running with our sleeping bags. And so you know where I slept that night? Because the girls were in the van. I slept in a real zen, real Kadesh, the truck stop washroom. And I was soaking wet and laid underneath the fan to dry your hands, hit it. Tried to go to sleep, truckers in and out all night. And this trip was from... Oh, I hate it. I just... But I didn't know that the wilderness was doing for me exactly what it was designed to do. I didn't know that it was one of the most important transitions of my life. And if I had turned around and gone back, I would have... We finally made it up into Canada, thank the Lord. And I remember they were opening up a position to be in young adult ministry there. And to make a long story short, they chose someone else over me again. Like now I had thought I passed the test. This is when the wilderness is really working you. You get back to Canada. You're ready to pastor. You're ready to preach. And they passed over me. They picked some other guy. He was the guitar player. And he became young adult pastor. And I said, that's fine, God. I've cleaned toilets. And if we're still in the wilderness, so be it. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to quit now. And that particular young adult pastor began to not show up and went through his own struggles, so they picked me from the back to come up and preach the first night that he didn't show up. So I preached, and man, did God move. Whatever anointing had been cultivated in those toilets, God just moved so powerfully. And it turned out with his work schedule and everything, he kept having to miss, and so they kept calling me up from the back to preach. And we had quite a move of God. And it was really powerful. Now, I don't know why they do this, but this particular church at the end of the year, they highlight the leaders of different ministries. And, everyone had heard about how God was moving in this young adult ministry. And so I saw up on the screen, they now were going to showcase the young adult department. I'm really telling you guys secrets tonight. And they had 2 blank names, and they would, the name would flash up. I don't know why they did this. And I sat at the back, and I got ready they're going to announce me. I dressed for this. I'm the man of God. I went from the pit to the palace. I'm ready to be announced. And they called the first name, and it was the guy that wasn't showing up. And I thought, and everybody stood and clapped. And the pastor had said, there has been just this move of the Spirit with our young adults. And they announced his name. And he got up and came to the came to the front. But there was room. There was one more name. So, well, that's going to be me. And I got ready to have my name announced, this move of God that's happened with the young people. And I'm telling you a true story. Okay, this is a true story. It's a wilderness story. This actually happened. For some reason, the name of the bass player of the worship team, his friend, the pastor's friend, was announced. And they called him up. And he stood on that stage with the guy, the host of this great move of God. And he stood on the stage as everyone clapped like this. And I sat back there. It was the toilets all over again. It was Zin all over again. It was Kadesh all over again. I was a nobody. And I sat back there, and I swear my face must have been red. I was so mad. Because I wanted to be recognized. But see, there's a point in the wilderness where you've kind of you realize I've signed up for this. And you get so traumatized that you kind of get like a fearless sort of, okay, I don't need recognition. Like it's been beaten out of you. You're so humbled. You're not even trying to be humble. Like it's not like you're reminding yourself to be humble. You are humbled. I honestly believe that humility is not something you put on. It's something that's done to you. And I sat back there, and I remember the prayer I prayed. I said this, God, I know how you are with wilderness. You're testing me. And if you're testing me, I smile at you and say, bring it on. And I sat back there and never had any recognition. Of course, after, a couple of them said, well, we really want to thank you. Like, I said, oh, yeah, well, God uses who he uses, just playing my part. And little did I realize, because at that point, I questioned whether God was going to use me. And that's what the wilderness will do to you. It'll bring you to a place where you start to question, is there even a promised land? Or did you bring us out here in this in-between wilderness place to kill us? That's what Israel thought. It got so bad that they thought that. And they began to grumble and complain, and I began to think, okay, maybe there isn't little did I realize, 3 months later, just 3 months later, I would be called by my father to travel to Amsterdam. And I would have a Nigerian man pastoring the largest church in all of Europe lay hands on me. And I would come home and pastor an incredible revival in our church that led to this, that led to this, that led to that, that led to and. But God could trust me now on the stage. I was able to come into a measure of my promised land because of what the wilderness had done to me. I was able to conquer giants that I would have been afraid of before. I was able to handle trial and challenges that would have crushed me before, because I chose to not quit when it was really tough. Don't quit yet. Don't stop believing now. God is leading us into something. Of course, we know the story because wilderness makes you weary. We know that as the people grumbled, Moses, probably tired of it. Moses says the people are thirsty, and God says, go and speak to the rock. And this was really crucial because God was wanting to introduce a new way of doing things. God was wanting to bring a shift. See, prior to that, Moses had smacked the rock. He hit the rock and water came out. Do you remember that? That happened in Scripture. When Israel was thirsty and they were grumbling again, he smacked the rock, and it was meant to be a prophetic type, and it was a prophetic type of the rock being Jesus. Out of your belly shall flow rivers of living water. The rock being Jesus smitten, where it says, and God was pleased to smite him, and living water came out that fed the people. This was all to be a picture of Jesus' death being smitten by God. This is what God did. And so it was absolutely crucial that when Moses went to bring forth water, that he didn't strike the rock again, because that would have been a picture of Jesus needing to be smitten again. And he didn't need to. He just had to die once and for all. So God gave Moses specific, controversial, bold, faith-filled, words. Now I want you to speak to the rock. And what we so often do when we're tired and weary and grumbling is we return to what we know worked before. We return to doing what was supposedly best before. We become what's called religious. Religion takes on many different forms. And we know that Moses struck the rock again. And God rebuked him for his unbelief. That he didn't trust God in that transition. Because he didn't trust God, he wasn't able to enter into the promise, was he? Moses, the all-star, wasn't able to enter into the promise because he didn't speak to the rock. What God was trying to paint a picture of was, I'm going to do a new thing. Jesus doesn't have to be crucified again. Now out of your belly, you're going to speak. And out of your belly shall come the living water that feeds the people. Jesus won't need to be crucified again. You people of God, just speak it. Just declare it. Just say it. Just out of your belly. What is it? Because your belly is so good? No, it's because there's a rock in there. It's Jesus Christ speaking through you. This was to be a profound painting and picture. And Moses messed it up because he was tired, he was weary, he was critical. The people had worn him out. The wilderness had wearied him. He became dim in his thinking, and he began to rip into the people. He called them rebels, and he smacked that rock. He functioned in anger rather than faith. He functioned in unbelief, and unbelief short-circuited his ability to be qualified to come into the promise that God had given. How many of us have missed it? How many of us are missing it now? Because we've come into a level of unbelief that disqualifies us, that causes us to go around the mountain again. And it's his mercy that he has us continue in the wilderness, because he's trying to deal with things so that we can move into all that he has for us. It was unbelief. I want to tell you tonight that God has made the transition as easy as possible for you by making the only qualification to be belief. Faith. When you don't see it, when it looks like the opposite, when it's worn you out, when he says remodel the building, when he's given you a vision, to hold on to that and to understand that wilderness seasons that we go through are actually tests. That's what I'm trying to get across to you. They're actually tests. And I remember when that man laid hands on me, that changed everything. The Dutch still say that it looked like two drunk men fighting. It was such a violent impartation, and my whole life changed big time. God gave me something special. And as I laid on that floor, it was like there was an open heaven. I could hear God clearly, like as a person speaks to a person. And I'll never forget what he said, and it still to this day challenges my theology a little bit. But he told me that I had committed the sin of unbelief. I didn't know there was really a sin of unbelief. But it sort of made sense because Jesus was always ticked off with the disciples at their faith. How much longer do I have to be with you? Unbelief short circuits God's power. He said, do not doubt me again. I'm going to use you. He spoke that to me while I was on the floor. It was one of the clearest words of the Lord I had ever heard, that I had committed the sin of unbelief. And God was rebuking me for doubting him. I want to move us tonight into a place of corporate faith for the promises of God. How many would say you're in a wilderness season? I feel like I'm in a wilderness season right now as it pertains to some of the promises of God. I feel like that financially. I feel like that in certain personal areas of my life. But guess what? I'm standing up here. Though it has wearied me at times to the point of wanting to quit or even go back to. See, when you won't go forward with God and you want to go back to where God was, that's called religion. Religion is just doing the form, even though God's glory has moved on. Some of us in this room, as we entered into church this morning and the worship was going, we were religious. Some of us it's never popular when the preacher touches on giving finances, but some of us, this morning or whenever, we're giving out of religiosity. We're giving because it's what we're supposed to do. And God is wanting you to give financially in faith. God is wanting you to step out and start a business in faith. I did not know how to do some of the things that our ministry is doing now. I had to step into it in faith. I wanted to go back to the old. I liked it the way it used to be. And God is pushing me out into this area that, see, to keep up with God, you just can't be religious. You just can't pitch your tent and stay there forever. God wants to move you into the new in Jesus' name. All over this place, would you stand and let's have the worship team come back, if you would. I want to anoint you for transition. I want to anoint you for transition tonight. And we'll pray for the sick, but my encouragement to you, don't turn back now. How many, this is a now word for you, don't turn back now. Almost everybody. It's a now word. Don't turn back now. Sometimes I laugh. I wish this Derek could go back to the Derek that was at the toilets and encourage and say, you won't be doing this forever. But you know what? There's another Derek. There's a 10 years from now Derek that will wish he could go back to this Derek that stands before you here and say, don't worry, that promise is coming. A little longer. Though it tarries, wait for it. Habakkuk chapter 2, record the vision. Write that thing down. What are the promises of God? What does your promised land look like? What does the promised land look like for Prince Edward Island? What does it look like for this church? What are the promises of God that have been spoken over this house and over your family and over your life? What are they? Begin to think about them. And maybe some of us here tonight have committed the sin of unbelief. Maybe our unbelief is holding us back from moving forward. Maybe we've taken on a critical spirit of some kind. Maybe we're committing that sin of doubt. I want you just to close your eyes and search your hearts for a moment.